everyone, and welcome to the SSPI podcast by Space and Satellite Professionals International. I'm Tamara Bond-Williams, Executive Director of SSPI. In this episode of The People Behind the Progress, we ask a different kind of question. How do you write the rules for innovation? Our guest, Mike Thompson, has spent more than 35 years shaping the frameworks that allow new technologies to take flight. Mike began his career with the UK Radiocommunications Agency, representing national interests in the regulation of mobile satellite and aeronautical communications. He joined Inmarsat in 1995, working on regulatory strategy for ICO Global Communications, where he helped secure the adoption of ETSI standards that opened the market for handheld satellite phones. In 1999, he co-founded Access Partnership, a pioneering consultancy that bridges technical policy, government relations, and spectrum regulation. Under his guidance, the firm became a trusted advisor to companies and governments worldwide, defining how innovation and regulation can coexist rather than collide. Mike and his team have played central roles in milestone achievements, introducing ultra-wideband technologies, protecting critical C-band infrastructure, codifying international radio regulations to ensure fairness at the ITU, establishing new allocations for aircraft tracking, and expanding maritime safety communications through non-GSO satellite networks. And through that work, he has helped craft the invisible architecture of trust and coordination that underpin today's satellite economy. His legacy lives in the regulatory pillars that enable innovation to flourish while safeguarding the shared spectrum we all depend on. Mike, welcome and congratulations on your nomination as one of the finalists for the UK Space and Satellite Personality of the Year Award.
Thank you so much, Tamara. I'm very honored to be here.
Absolutely. And before I go any further, that was a mouthful. You've got a storied career. Did I get that introduction right? Or was there anything you'd like to correct?
Sure. Yeah, no, for sure. I've, as I've kind of hinted at, there's a number of different elements that I've done, all under the same umbrella. But it's touched on a number of different technologies and a number of areas of the satellite industry. So yeah, a lot to talk about, I think.
Absolutely. Well, let's start here. What first drew you to the regulatory side of telecommunications?
So I had completed my original degree in electrical engineering, and I had worked as a field engineer for a short time overseas. And when I returned to the UK, I was quite interested in doing a master's degree. And at the time, the regulator in the UK, who I hadn't come across before, called the Radiocommunications Agency, they were offering sponsorships to attend an MSc for a year in return for joining them as a professional engineer, and it kind of chimed with what I wanted to do, and of course assisted me to do the MSc, and so I did a year's master's course and then joined the Radiocommunications Agency. And it was a somewhat new world for me. I hadn't really appreciated the extent to which governments were involved in international regulation, particularly radio communications regulation. But it was really interesting, and I was very fortunate to work with some very inspired people who recognised, this was in the early 90s. My boss at the time recognised that regulation was changing very quickly, particularly in the satellite field. And that the regulator had to kind of adapt in order to encourage innovation rather than kind of standing in its way. And that was that was my introduction to regulation, was trying to be facilitative with others in the field. So I was very much I was very fortunate in my introduction that way.
Thank you so much. You were talking about the early 90s. I came into SSPI in 2001. I think that's true. think that's true. Yeah, I'm 25. It's going to be 25 years this year. So yeah, it was 2001.
Congratulations! That's a long tenure. That's very good. I know people who for whom 5 years in a role is a long time, and they're looking to move on. So congratulations.
You know, that
That's the right
used
thing
to
to
be
do.
me. I used to stay on a job for about 9 months, and so apparently something about the space and satellite industry is a keeper. But you were talking about the recognition early on that the regulations needed to, the process of regulation and the way we think about regulation needed to change in order to make space for this technology. What were some of the challenges that you were up against at that time?
I think the biggest challenges at the time when I entered the industry was that it was largely dominated by a handful of semi-state players. So we had Intelsat, who was an intergovernmental organization at the time. Inmarsat, of course, was a mobile satellite operator, but again, an intergovernmental organization headquartered here in London. And they had largely driven the regulatory landscape at that point. However, there's starting in the US, of course, with PanAmSat and others, of course, there had been started to become a breakdown of that monopoly situation, and there was an interest, a very strong interest, in having private sector developing and establishing satellite communication players. And I think that was at the time when I joined. That was the key aspect, was really trying to find a way of creating a multiplayer space where previously it had been effectively a monopoly for various reasons, some good, some bad. But I think setting up Intelsat in the 1960s, if you look back in the history and the risks being taken at the time when Intelsat was set up, of course, it made sense to do it the way they did. But by the 90s, of course, those reasons had largely disappeared, and the risks were very well known, very well quantified. And so, the landscape had to change.
Yeah, I love recounting, especially now with the dramatic change of some of those industry players. You used to work for Inmarsat; they're now part of Viasat, and of course, Intelsat and SCS have now merged. And both of them were also governmental agencies that became commercial players, and they're now dramatically changing in response to the commercial pressures and challenges facing them. So as you think about that landscape, how do you balance in today's world? How do we balance competing priorities when you're thinking about what are the frameworks that are going to affect all the players, that including government and commercial and across an international space?
So I think that the perspective I have always taken is, what's the greatest good that can be done here? Now, obviously, a large part of my career I've been working for private entities, either in working for the companies themselves or working in a consultancy role. But we're generally the starting point is what's the greatest good that can be done here? If we have a piece of spectrum, a regulator might look at it and say, well, we've got 5 different applicants for this piece of spectrum and 5 different technologies. Which one should we give it to? And the question becomes, well, do we decide to give it to one to the exclusion of the others, or should we somehow divide it up, either ask them to take a 5th share each, or somehow divide it up some other way? And I think that's really where my role has really focused on, is trying to maximize that outcome. You could, in any given situation, you could simply, like a slice of cake, cut the cake up equally into pieces, but that may not be the best outcome. It may be that one particular application will have a greater good, will have a more profound impact on society compared to others. And I take an example, perhaps not the most favorite example of the satellite industry, but we've seen the mobile industry acquiring large tranches of spectrum over the last 25 years at an international level in order to standardize 3G, then 4G, then 5G communications, and of course 6G to come. And we have seen the benefits that has accrued. But of course, there reaches a point at some point when that's, those technologies perhaps have matured and they're no longer delivering. And I think the types of satellite communications that were delivered in the early 90s when I first started are almost unrecognizable compared to what we need today. Today, TV broadcast is pretty much disappearing, and certainly in the developed world and even parts of the developing world as well. And it's being replaced by mobility and by internet access, or various forms of on-demand internet access, for which satellite is actually well served and can be adapted very effectively. And I think that's one of those stories where we have to see that the actual the technology evolves, and we have to then adapt the regulation with each step as well.
Yeah. You said a thing, and I'm not sure this is totally on topic, but you said a thing that I wanted to call up, just the dramatic change. And it's not just that the spectrum is changed, not just that, but I'm just thinking about the user experience, right? Like, I was just in California. It was over the weekend, and my favorite show's new episode drops over the weekend, and I'm not home, but I can pull it up on Netflix, right, on my phone. and so I do. And then I start thinking, I say, my son almost watches all of his television on his phone, which I think is insane. But this is a dramatic change, and the technology has made that possible. And the technology, we've been talking in the industry rather with excitement and bated breath and all of that, of the coming convergence, the emerging convergence between mobile and satellite. What part have you been in terms of thinking through that regulatory framework for this convergence that's happening right now? And as you mentioned, the coming 6G.
Yeah, so as you say, a lot of the things that we used to do, the example you gave is a great one. Watching TV. Watching TV used to be, when I was a kid, I'm sure the same with you, it was a family thing. You sat down in front of a box in the front room, and at a set time in the evening, 7 or 8 p.m., and you would watch the show together. And if your mum or your dad didn't want to watch it, then they'd go off and read a book or read the paper or something else. But that was the choice. You had a limited choice, and maybe you could change channels and choose a different subject. But that was the way TV was watched. And I think in the internet era, all of those things, all those bonds have been loosened now, and the way we consume that kind of media is very, very different. Your son is no different, I think, to most people, including me. I looked just recently at how often that I watch TV live, and it was almost never in exactly that way. I find I almost never watch it. I watch catch-up TV shows on the internet, or I watch Netflix or that kind of service. Almost exclusively now. I had difficulty remembering the last time I'd watched TV live, just because I'd got out of the habit. And I think it's the way we do now. And I think your point was, what do we do in the industry now to adapt to that? And I think the simple answer is, well, obviously we need spectrum to provide that. The example you gave of watching it on your mobile, of course, well, the mobile industry has gone out and got that spectrum. But what happens if you're not in an area that's well served by 5G, or in a rural place? And there's plenty of places in the US where internet connection, or 5G connection is not so great, and in the wider world as well. So that's when we look to other technologies, including obviously long distance Wi-Fi, long distance wireless, but also satellite, of course, that can fill in those gaps. And that's, I think, where planning has to come in. So I came back to my point earlier that when we look at a piece of spectrum, we have to decide, okay, there may be fewer people using this piece of spectrum, but is it important that they have access to this service through this spectrum because they have fewer alternatives? Obviously, you and I, if we live in a city, we can probably use fiber. We have a fiber connection in our house. Maybe we have a 5G connection if we're out and about in a mobile environment. But what happens when we're living in a farm that's a long way away from anywhere, or we're in a remote village, a remote town where the internet connection is quite poor? And that's when I think we have to say, okay, well, that's an environment where perhaps satellite broadband is going to be a key deliverer for those. When you move outside particularly out of the developing world, you can see how critical it is for certain industries. And I just take agriculture as being a very common one that we encounter, where a particular grower of a particular crop or a particular remote resource is being mined. actually connecting those places to the global market is actually critical now. Even I found cocoa growers in Ghana apparently are super critical, super reliant upon the internet in order to gauge the demand for their product, in order to gauge the global pricing for cocoa beans. For example, you and I buy a candy bar at the corner store, but that has come through a long chain from the growers in Ghana producing the cocoa beans to be processed and then created into chocolate bars and then to be sold. So it's part of a much longer chain, and those people at the end critically need that connection in order to effectively serve the market.
Yeah.
You are listening to The Better Satellite World, the longest running continuous podcast in the commercial space and satellite industry. The Better Satellite World podcast is funded by the corporate partners of SSPI, Hughes, Axis Intelligence, the American Space Exploration Fund, and Qvia. Have you heard about SBQ? Space Business Qualified is a popular online learning program for industry professionals designed by JSOA, SSPI, and SatProf. To learn more, visit spacebq.org. In November, join Tamara, Space News Magazine, and the New York Space Alliance for the next New York Space Business Roundtable. If you want to get inside the industry's biggest issues and investments, meet startups and high-profile industry leaders from around the world, the Roundtable is the real New York event you cannot miss. To register, visit sspi.org/events. And now back to the Better Satellite World.
You're being recognized as a finalist for this UK Space and Satellite Personality of the Year Award. Tell me a little bit about, well, let me finish that thought. You're being recognized in the context of our Better Satellite World Awards dinner. And so I'm deeply grateful for you drawing the connection, the human connection between what our industry enables, the fact that, that a market can mature and succeed because we provide the connectivity that allows access. That is the kind of thing that we try to recognize through our Better Satellite World campaign, because it's so invisible, right? And you don't realize, like you say, when you buy that candy bar, you don't realize, first of all, how did it get to you? But you also don't realize how many of the things you might take for granted that have to be there in order for that all to work, including access to information, which a lot of times is only available through satellite communication. So thank you for making that connection for us.
Welcome. I think it's a very important part of the satellite industry is that by its nature it's global. The industry has always been global, and it plays a role in that global connection.
Yeah. Well, so when you think about innovation-friendly environment, what distinguishes the regulatory environment to make it innovation-friendly?
So I think the challenge that we have always faced is making sure that the regulator is aware of what's happening in the wider world. It's very easy for a regulator, particularly a domestic regulator, to have a very narrow vision about the needs of their particular market, and perhaps not necessarily see the wider picture. I think to an extent, and again, I'll give credit to the mobile industry. The standardization of the mobile industry has had a profound effect on everybody, you and I, and people, a million miles from our orbits. You buy a mobile phone for a few $100s. If you wanted to buy a budget model, the subscription is maybe a few tens of dollars per month. The costs are actually very, very affordable, very, very accessible. And that picture is true throughout the world. When you go to a regulator, the regulator will understand that, of course, immediately. But if you go to the regulator and you say, okay, we want to license a new type of satellite broadband service in your country, immediately they'll look and they'll say, oh, no, wait a second, we've got an active market in our country. We have a good supply. We've got 3 providers or 3 competitors in the market providing internet access to the home. Why would we need someone else to come in? Why would we need someone outside of let's say the US or the UK, why would we need them to do that? And it's important to kind of give them that perspective that actually, just in the same way as the mobile industry has flourished because there are international standards and there are multiple operators, multiple manufacturers anywhere in the world that you can buy your equipment from, the same is true of satellite communications, that actually will become much more competitive, and it will help to fill in some of those niches that can't be served by other forms of communication. We're seeing, I give an example in the UK because I'm particularly familiar with it here. The requirement by Ofcom, the regulator now, is to provide something like 97 or 98% population coverage in the UK, which sounds great, but of course that overlooks the fact that there are large areas of very low population density in parts of the UK, particularly in Scotland, where coverage is actually very, very poor, and other forms of internet access like fibre are very, very slow to roll out to those areas because, of course, the cost per person is very high. And that's an area where the regulator has actually, some years back, has actually kind of taken stock and said, actually, we can see that satellite plays a role here. We can see that satellite could be used to roll out those higher speeds to people in more remote areas more cost effectively. And we were able to kind of play that. We were able to kind of enlighten them in that area. And so they could see the importance of that. And that from then on, of course, it was a much easier sell than to say, well, okay, well, now you need to look at your satellite regulations to make sure that they are supportive of what you're trying to do here. So we were trying to link the policy ambitions of the regulator with the capabilities of the industry itself.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit about, Access Partnership. Let's start with why, right? Why is there an Access Partnership? Why did you decide that we needed one?
So, yeah, myself and my co-founder, Greg Francis, had been working at ICO in the late 90s, and we had been doing a lot of work, a lot of groundwork to introduce a new mobile satellite service. Unfortunately, the company itself was not successful, but we had, in the process of doing so, we had recognized that actually a lot of the problems, a lot of the challenges that we faced trying to get market access in a lot of different countries very quickly were very, very similar. The regulators had similar concerns and similar perspectives. Of course, all of them were domestic. They were looking at their domestic side and saying, well, we don't want to be bothered with this. So we had to develop a way of showing why it was of interest to them and why it could serve their greater good, their greater needs, if they were to be more flexible, more receptive to this new technology. So fast forward to ICO's demise, and Greg and I decided that actually we'd quite like to do this again and keep some of the contacts that we had developed over the years. One of the things that we found what was very effective was actually using a sort of multinational team, because we were then able to bring in specialists and perhaps even bring in examples from other jurisdictions. So I'll give you a good example. We were doing some work in Kenya, and then we actually then engaged with the regulator in Uganda, and the regulator was interested in what we were doing, but they were particularly switched on when we said, actually, we did something similar in Kenya. And then they were really, okay, well, if our neighbour's done it, what did you do for them? What happened there? And they were really interested, not in an example that we gave them of Western Europe, but of an example that they had in Eastern Africa. What were the problems that the Kenyans had seen? How did you solve it? How can it apply? How will it apply? How can it apply to our market? And that was kind of the basis of it. We recognised that was actually a really effective model. And so we decided to take that into a consultancy environment and work along those lines.
Okay. And so you set up this consultancy where you're giving guidance and advice, here's how you need to be thinking about this environment. Here's how you need to be thinking about what the regulations ought to be. And here's how you step into the market. What's been the biggest challenge that you've seen, especially you're being recognized for work in the UK? What were some of the challenges specific to the UK market that, especially as the UK has been doing such an aggressive effort of building out its space industry.
So the build out of the space industry is a relatively recent phenomenon in the UK, and I think it builds upon sort of past history. We've had obviously Inmarsat was founded in the UK. We have pieces of Airbus, formerly British Aerospace in the UK, actually building satellite hardware. So there has always been that legacy in the UK. I think the UK, just rewinding to the start of my career in the early 90s, the UK was part of the European Club. We call it CEPT, the European Club of Regulators. And the UK had taken a very active role in that way back in the late 80s, early 90s. And they were trying to sort of pursue deregulation in a lot of different fields, and satellite was one of those. So our relationship with the UK was actually quite had good synergies, because they wanted to actually project UK policy and UK approach to regulation. And we were quite keen that in a lot of European countries that the regulations were loosened and were made a little bit more industry friendly, and particularly friendly to private industry, because there was still in the early 90s, there was still a sense that the government really should be in charge, that really we should still have. There were still monopolies in place in France, in Germany, and many other countries as well. And they hadn't quite got to that stage of deregulation of the telecom market. So we were actually working very closely with the UK on that, and it was actually a very favourable time for me. I found that a very productive and very cooperative time, because we were actually pushing, if you like, what's the expression, pushing against an open door. Regulators were interested in new technologies. They could recognize the benefits of it, but they were also kind of somewhat nervous about some of the drawbacks. And so they were, understandably, as regulators should do, but they want to make sure that sort of market forces are kept in balance, and that they're not doing away with one monopoly only to create another. And so we were having to kind of go through the role play scenarios there and say, well, okay, well, if you take away the restriction for monopoly providers, how do you then create a level playing field so everyone has an equal opportunity to compete in that place? And that was really interesting. That was one of the things that I found most interesting at my time at the regulator, then at my time in Inmarsat, and then subsequently in private practice and consultancy. The UK was always quite active in that. They've become, in more recent years, they've become less active. I think, like a lot of regulators, they've kind of suffered some budgetary constraints, and so they've had to limit their involvement. But I think at a policy level, they're still very active, and they still pursue a lot of policy goals through ITU and other important forums.
Yeah, you're hitting on the question I was trying to formulate, and it's not. Still hasn't completely formulated, but I'm giving it my best shot here. You were mentioning about the change in budget, the change in the environment that makes it easy for regulators to sustain. But, in order for regulators to sustain the regime that they've set up, or to enforce it, to have the ability to maintain it, requires, the support of the sponsoring agencies. Is there a place for a company like Access Partnership to step in when there's this instability of government? There's change of policy, there's lack of budget. How does a company like yours help, or even help companies to navigate through the changes that are happening or will happen?
So it can be quite challenging, and one of our most effective roles has been to kind of highlight how other administrations have done it, or how the same problem is being solved in another region, and that's been very effective. As I said, I gave you the example of Kenya and Uganda, but we've seen many examples of that. Certainly, with new technologies coming to market, everyone is interested to see, what are the pitfalls, identifying what the pitfalls are, and finding the possible solutions to those. So they're always interested in hearing how another administration has done it, and I think that's kind of where we can help to fill in some of the gaps, and where administrations maybe don't have the research budget to go out and research a new technology. We can help provide some of the information about that, our own research, but we can also highlight where other research has been done by other entities, perhaps other regulators, and maybe it's been Australian government comes to mind. Sometimes they do some research on their domestic market for a new technology. And actually, although it's the other side of the world from Europe, actually some of the fundamentals are exactly the same, and some of the fundamentals are applicable to the European market as well. So we've done that too. That cross-fertilization is actually really, really useful in a standardized technology industry like satellite.
Yeah. Well, that's so helpful for me. Thank you for bringing this out. I guess I have one more question just for you, which is just, when you think about the next generation, and I took note that early on in our conversation, you mentioned that your role with Access Partnership even is actually changed. And so looking to the future, what advice do you give to the next generation as they think about the future needs and demands of space and satellite, and what the regulatory environment and policy should be going forward? What stands out as key for the next generation?
I think one of the lessons that I've learned is actually developing relationships with the regulators themselves. That's something that has really paid dividends over my career. People that I knew in my very early days in the regulator in the UK, people in other administrations within Europe, and particularly in the ITU. I knew some of those faces all the way through from the early 90s to today, and I still have. There are still people that I deal with today that I first met back in 1991. So yeah, it still does. So I think maintaining those relationships is actually very important. It also helps when you go and speak to someone new at a regulator to say, well, I did work with your colleagues or your predecessor on another technology, so I'm aware of your of some of the constraints that your government or your regulator has in this field. Maybe we can start there. I think it's always important to be a little bit humble with regulators, because they have their own difficulties to face themselves, of course. And I think actually almost coming with a gift, if you like, something, here's some information or here's some research that we think you might find useful, can always be helpful, because it shows that this is not a one-sided conversation. And I think if I was to say anything to my colleagues and my younger colleagues, it's develop those relationships. Don't go to a regulator only don't make the first conversation you have with the regulator a question or a request. Go and develop that relationship first, and then you can go and ask for things later.
Thank you so much. Mike, I very much appreciate that advice. You are certainly a very personable personality.
That's very kind of you.
And so thank you for that advice. I think you're showing us how it is done. So that concludes this episode of The People Behind the Progress, our conversation with Mike Thompson, a finalist for the UK Space and Satellite Personality of the Year Award. We hope you join us at the Better Satellite World Awards dinner on 1 December 2025, that's the British way of saying it, at the Royal Horse Guards Hotel in London to see who wins this year's award. It's an evening that brings together the people and companies building a more connected, sustainable, and inspiring space future. You'll find tickets and details at sspi.org on our event page for the Better Satellite World Awards dinner. This podcast is made possible by the support of SSPI's professional, student, and corporate members, and of course, our partners who believe in a better satellite world. For SSPI and our producer, Ari Yates, I'm Tamara Bond-Williams. And for all those who are building a space and satellite future worthy of our highest aspirations, thank you for all that you do.